So actually we're looking at the nervous system. So to begin with, the nervous system is made up of the central nervous system, so the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So the central nervous system consists of the brain, also known as the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. The spinal cord communicates between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. So any information coming in from the peripheral nervous system will feed into the spinal cord and will be sent up to the brain for the brain to compute and analyse to make a decision on. However, there are examples where the spinal cord does know or is able to make a decision as well. So an example is if you put your hand on something really, really hot, your body will send an impulse from your hand down your peripheral nervous system to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord will know instantly that that's an immediate danger and will send an impulse back, causing you to move your hand in almost a reflex manner. Whereas if you were sat in a warm room, for example, so no extreme danger, your peripheral nervous system will feed back to your central nervous system. That message will go from your spinal cord up to your brain, and your brain might then make you change behaviours. So it might make you take a jumper off to cool you down, or you might vasodilate to your skin to help you radiate heat away from your body. So there's kind of more quick, immediate responses, but more behavioural responses as well. And the peripheral nervous system, which is the kind of feeding into this, is anything outside of your brain and spinal cord really. So it could be your digestive system, it could be your respiratory system, it could be the release of any hormones, your blood pressure, anything within movement wise, so like your proprioceptors within your ankles, your knees, your muscles. All of that will feed back into your body in terms of how you're positioned and how well you perform in a movement. But also things like touch, so your skin in terms of touch, so pressure, temperature, pain, anything like that. Your peripheral nervous system will feed into your central nervous system. So quite a lot of stimulus if you can imagine all the different inputs. Your peripheral nervous system can be broken down into 4 other sections. So the first one is autonomic. You can then have somatic, sympathetic, and parasympathetic. So your autonomic system, think of it as automatic. That's something that you don't necessarily control. Think of your somatic first. So somatic is something that you do control. So somatic is any voluntary function. So if you're walking, moving, running, lifting a weight, you don't need to do that to survive. You're choosing to stand up, you're choosing to do a deadlift and things like that. However, if you do something somatically, your autonomic system will follow almost immediately. So it'll automatically. So if you start doing a deadlift, your heart rate will increase, your breathing will increase, your blood pressure will increase, and things like that. So autonomic is anything that really your body does to survive on a day-to-day basis. So it could be breathing, heart rate, release of enzymes, hormones, anything like that internally that you don't actually tell yourself to do. Whereas if you go to pick a drink up or a cup of coffee, then you're somatically, you're telling yourself what to do there. And then depending on what you're doing, you'll either promote or activate the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is what speeds you up. So during exercise, when you start to deadlift or you start to warm up or anything like that, you will increase your heart rate, you'll increase your blood pressure, and that's essentially your fight or flight response. You're either there to it's going to ramp you up to fight somebody or to run away from that situation, is in terms of like a primal response. And then the opposite to sympathetic is parasympathetic. So you're parasympathetic, so think parachute. Your parasympathetic nervous system will bring you down, it will slow your heart rate down, it will bring your blood pressure down, and that's often then described as your peace. So you've got war and peace, something that's going to ramp you up and get ready for something, or peace that's going to help you slow down. So if you think of that in terms of when you're warming up and preparing for exercise, your heart rate will start to increase, your blood pressure will start to increase, blood flow, you'll start to sweat. But then towards the end of the session, while you might be cooling down and stretching and relaxing, you'll start to promote your parasympathetic. And there's just hopefully a little diagram to show you. So your central nervous system, your peripheral nervous system, you then have your somatic or your autonomic, and your autonomic can then be split into either the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So while we're using this system, we are sending nervous impulses around our body. So we need to understand the structure and the function of a cell. So this in particular is a motor neuron or a motor nerve. So motor neuron means it's kind of connecting to a muscle rather than like a brain nerve or something like that. But imagine this almost as an electrical cable. So the dangly dendrites, think of those dendrites as a plug. They're plugging into your brain, and your brain will send an impulse down this nerve. The cell body, which has a nucleus in it, and some what you call some cytoplasm, which is like a plasma in the cell. That the main purpose of that is just so it tells this cell body what its function is, so it knows what it is and what its job is. But the electrical impulse will travel down the wire, which is what you call the axon. But that axon is covered in a myelin sheath. So imagine when you're sending an electrical impulse down a wire in a plug, those wires are covered in little plastic outer coatings to protect the electrical impulse. That's what your myelin sheath does. But interestingly, the more myelin sheath you have, the faster the impulse, the faster the contraction. So if we're trying to do something quite fast and explosive, we will generally be using nerves that have more myelin sheath around it. Whereas if we are doing something quite slow and quite pedestrian-like, then we're probably using nerves with less myelin sheath because we don't need to send an impulse as fast. So you can have different types of motor nerves for different functions. And then when it reaches the end of this nerve, think of it now plugging into the muscle, that's what you call your synapse or your synaptic junction. And that's kind of like a zoomed in view of it. So where the nerve plugs into the muscle, when it does do that, it releases a chemical called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. It's kind of like a precursor. It lets your body know that something's about to happen. And when that acetylcholine is released, it causes a bit of a chemical reaction. So acetylcholine causes calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is what they call an organelle in your muscle. It's like a reservoir of calcium. People often associate calcium with bones, which is correct. You need calcium for your strong bones, but every single muscular contraction in your body requires calcium as well. What calcium does is it inhibits two enzymes. You've got an enzyme, one's called troponin and one's called tropomyosin. And these enzymes are like chemical force fields. They will cover the myosin and actin binding sites. So the myosin and the actin can't constantly contract. And we're going to talk about these myosin and actin fibers in a second. But the job of troponin and tropomyosin is to cover these sites, this myosin and this actin, so they can't touch each other, so they can't contract. But when you release calcium, it gets rid of these enzymes, it gets rid of troponin and tropomyosin, and it allows your myosin and your actin to bind together. When they do bind together, they will contract and your muscle will shorten, which is what you call the sliding filament theory. And all of that will happen at 320 miles an hour. So from the point, imagine when you're clicking your fingers, you send an impulse down your brain, down the nerve to those muscles, and you can click your fingers really, really quickly, and you can unclick them and then click them again almost immediately. So it's a really, really, fast, impressive reaction of events, especially if you then think of that the next time if you're squatting or lunging, how many electrical impulses you will be sending out simultaneously to lots of different muscles, tendons, all the different feedback that's coming in from your peripheral nervous system, all the other things that are happening in terms of increasing heart rate, increasing blood pressure, increasing breathing, and while your mind's probably thinking about what you're going to be having for tea as well, there's just a lot of information going on, and we do it all, pretty much faultlessly. And when that muscle contracts, it's what you call the sliding filament theory. So a way to remember this for me would be first of all, you send an impulse. You send an impulse down an axon that's covered in a myelin sheath. When it gets to the end of that nerve, it's called the synapse. At the synapse, we release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine then causes the release of calcium. Calcium will then inhibit two enzymes. One's called troponin and one's called tropomyosin. They will then allow the myosin and the actin binding sites to bind to each other. That then allows your muscle to contract and shorten. And when that happens, it's called the sliding filament theory. So we just need to look at the structure of a muscle, because we've just mentioned some fibres called actin and myosin, and we just need to know a little bit more about that. So firstly, the different types of muscle in your body. The one that we're probably most interested in is skeletal muscle. So that's muscle that connects to your skeletal system so we can move and we can exercise. Skeletal muscle is striated. So what I mean by that is like a bag of strings. So think when you see someone who's really lean, and you can almost see like fibres in the shoulders and in the pecs and stuff like that. That's because the muscle is striated, and it's like a bag of string. We predominantly use skeletal muscle for movement, and it is voluntary. So, we tell ourselves to pick up a bottle or to use a pen or something like that. Whereas you can also have smooth muscle, and smooth muscle is generally your digestive system and your blood vessels. So our digestive system is how we move food down our digestive system. It's the contraction of this smooth muscle, and that's what we call peristalsis, the movement of food, and the type of contraction that occurs. And these smooth muscles are involuntary. So, we don't eat an apple and tell our stomach and our digestive system to kind of contract and move this piece of food down our digestive system. It just happens. So, we don't control that. It's involuntary. And the third muscle is your cardiac muscle, which is your heart. So what's unique about your heart is it never fatigues. It's 100% aerobic. It has its own coronary artery blood supply, and it will never fatigue. And obviously when it does, it's kind of game over. And that again is involuntary, so you don't tell your heart rate to speed up, decrease, or anything like that. It just happens without you knowing. So in terms of skeletal muscle, we're just going to look at the structure. So here you can see some of the key words coming down. So a tendon will join a muscle to a bone, and you'll then have what you call the outer fascia of the muscle. So think of a muscle as an electrical cable. If you can look at an electrical cable now, you've got a thick outer part of the cable. That's what your epimysium is. And then in that cable, you've then got 3 smaller cables. But each cable has then got a cover of its own protective fascia, again, so like your green, blue and brown wires, for example. But then in there, you've then got a wire that is then made up of even smaller fibres. So, not dissimilar, your muscles kind of got an outer fascia called your epimysium. In there, you've got bundles of fibres called a fascicle or a fasciculi, and they will then have a fascia called a perimysium, and then in there you have another smaller bundle called a muscle fibre. That muscle fibre will have a fascia called an endomysium around it, and then in there you've got like the smallest fibre, so to speak, which is your myofibril, but that myofibril is then made up of the smallest myofilaments called your actin and your myosin. So for me, if you can remember almost the flow of these words, so epimysium, epi in the human body means high or above. So in this case, it's the highest fascia, it's the one on the outside. If you then look at the last fascia, the endomysium, that's the one at the end, and then you've got a perimysium in the middle. So if you can remember the flow of epi, peri, endo, and then you've got fascicle, muscle fibre, myofibril, and then that myofibril is then broken into actin and myosin. So hopefully just some key words in a bit of a flow to help you try and remember the structure of this skeletal muscle. And the muscle itself and these actin and myosins are then separated along the muscle by what you call a sarcomere. So you can see in the image where you've kind of got red sections split up with these little blue lines. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections in there. Where those blue zagged lines are, that's the sarcomere. So that sarcomere kind of divides your actin and myosin into blocks or units down your muscle length. And it's these actin and myosin that will then contract and cause the muscle to shorten. And that shortening is what you call the sliding filament theory. So here you can see a zoom in where your myosin, which is your big fibre, what you call your mighty myosin, these myosin heads, which you can see there like clubs, want to bind on to the actin myosin binding sites. So you've got myosin, which has myosin binding heads, and you've got actin, which has myosin binding sites. Covering those is tropomyosin and troponin, so they want to connect and they want to contract. So we need a chemical force field to stop that. So we produce these enzymes called tropomyosin and troponin. But when we do want to contract, we send that impulse, which we've just covered. That causes acetylcholine to be released. That causes calcium to be released. We then inhibit those enzymes, and it allows the myosin heads to bind onto the actin sites, which then allows the muscle to contract and shorten. Sorry, a bit of a spelling mistake there. Should be actin, not action. Okay, so hopefully that's the contraction, that's the electrical impulse of our nervous system. That's how we send an impulse from our brain to our muscle, and it's then the structure of the muscle and how the muscle contracts. But with that, we also need to be aware of something called a motor unit. So a motor unit is the nerve, so the motor neuron that we've just explained, and all the muscle fibres that nerve can innervate or stimulate. So we send an electrical impulse down our arm, for example. We're trying to do a bicep curl. We send an impulse down our nerve. If that nerve connects or stimulates 5 muscle fibres, for example, it will either activate all of those 5 muscle fibres, or it will activate none. We can't say activate 2.5 fibres, please. It's like a light switch. It's either on or off. So that's important for us to send a strong enough impulse to make sure that we can activate this motor unit and all the fibres it connects to. And we can have, and that's where whether we need slow or fast motor units. So we said earlier that we can have different myelin sheaths. So the more fat that is surrounding a nerve, the faster the impulse. So if we're trying to do something quite fast and explosive, we will send a fast impulse. We'll send a lot of conviction, a lot of effort down certain nerves that can then transfer and send that impulse fast and quickly, and therefore those nerves will connect to a bigger motor unit, and that bigger motor unit will then connect to bigger muscle fibres and more muscle fibres, so it allows us to produce a bigger force. Whereas if we were just walking down the street, or you're just kind of adjusting your posture, then that's a slow controlled movement. So we'll send a slower impulse down a motor neuron that has less fat around it, less myelin sheath, which means it will then connect to a slow motor unit or a smaller motor unit, and that smaller motor unit will connect to less muscles and not as powerful muscles, and therefore it will be more suited to doing these small adjustments and contractions and stuff. And this is where we can then link in our types of muscle fibres. So our type 1, which would be classed as slow twitch and very aerobic, would require less stimulus to activate, but the benefit of that is they can last a long time. Our type 2A, which is like your lactic acid system, you require more stimulus to get them because we need higher forces, but a downside is they might not last as long. And then the final one is your type 2B, so these are classed as fast twitch as well. They take a lot of stimulus to recruit, so you've really got to be focused and ramping up and really trying to put a lot of effort in. They last for a very low duration, but they will produce a very high force production. So depending on what we're doing, we will dictate how much stimulus we send down our nerves. That will dictate which nerve we use and how much myelin sheath is around that nerve. that will dictate which motor units we're activating and innervating. That will then dictate how many fibres and what type of fibres we activate, which is then going to impact on how we perform the movement or the exercise. And all of that is called the all or none. So a motor unit is made up of the nerve and all of the muscle fibres that it connects to or stimulates. If the stimulus is strong enough to trigger an action, then it will spread through the whole length of the muscle fibre and activate every muscle fibre. Conversely, if the stimulus is not strong enough, then there will be no action potential and no muscle contraction will occur. Motor units cannot vary the amount of force they generate. They either contract maximally or not at all, and that's what we call the all or none law. So just briefly to summarise there, we've spoke about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system and just the structure of that. We then spoke about how we send an electrical impulse down that nerve. We've then spoke about the structure of a muscle and then how that muscle contracts through the different mechanisms. The last bit is hopefully just to understand the different muscle fibre types that we briefly touched on there. So you can have three types of fibre types. You have a type 1, normally known as slow twitch, but can be known as slow oxidative. Type 2A, which are known as fast twitch, but can be known as oxidative glycolytic. And then type 2B, which are also known as fast twitch, but the difference there is the duration and the amount of force between type 2A and type 2B. So classically, your slow twitch, your type 1 fibres will be aerobic. Your type 2A would be anaerobic, but normally kind of feeding into your lactic acid system because we might be doing exercise for maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 seconds. And your fast type 2B would be anaerobic, but classically we'll be using the creatine phosphate because the creatine phosphate system, because it'll be really short, sharp, fast and explosive and less than 10 seconds. So this is just a table to hopefully illustrate that. So in the first column where you've got aerobic, your aerobic system, so your aerobic energy system, is mostly associated with your type 1 muscle fibres, with your slow oxidative muscle fibres. So this is the system and the muscle fibre you're going to use when you're walking or you're doing a slow, steady jog, some sort of continuous exercise for a long duration. The benefit of this type of muscle fibre is it does produce a low amount of force in relation to what you could produce, and it does produce the force slowly, but it's got a very high tolerance to fatigue, so it takes a long time for these muscle fibres to fatigue. So these are the fibres used when you're running 5Ks, 10Ks, half a marathon and stuff like that. They will, even though they're quite low force production and they produce that energy quite slowly, you can do that for a very, very long time. So they've got a high tolerance to fatigue. Generally then, we're going to be using these fibres and your aerobic energy system in any exercise that is over 2 minutes in general. Because we're working for such a long period of time and we're using our aerobic system, we need a good supply of oxygen, we need a good supply of carbohydrates, we need a good supply of fats. So these muscles will have a good blood supply, and therefore if you were to look at them under a microscope, they will be red in colour. If you just then look at the opposite side of the table, so we're looking at the ATP-CP system, so your adenosine triphosphate creatine phosphate system. This energy system is associated with fast explosive movements, and therefore we're going to use our type 2B fibres, our fast twitch fibres. The benefit of these fibres in that system is you're going to get very high force production. The force production that you do will be very, very fast and explosive, but a downside is they have a very low tolerance to fatigue, so they will only last up to 10 seconds, and even that's a bit of an exaggeration really. It's, your ATP will last for about 5 seconds, and then your creatine phosphate will start to replenish that system for another 5 seconds, and then you've used it completely. The ATP-CP system is almost like a chemical that your body will have in your muscles as a bit of a safety pack, so it gives you an instant burst of energy if you need to get away from danger. So these types of muscle fibers don't have a very good blood supply because they don't need as much oxygen, they don't need as much carbs or fats. They will have a blood supply because they're still living tissue, but if you were to look at them under a microscope, they would look more white in colour. Just while we're on there, people often ask the question, can your fibres be red, can they be white? And they can, but in humans they are normally, you get a combination of all of them because we're middle of the road, we don't live extreme lifestyles like an animal does. But to give you an example, if you're familiar with like a homing pigeon can fly hundreds of miles in one go. So to do that, it needs to flap its wings continuously for hours and hours. So it will need a very good type 1 and a type 1 muscle fibre and a very good aerobic system. So when it's flying the hundreds of miles, if you were to look at a pigeon's breast, it would be red in colour because it has that good blood supply and it's using its type 1 fibres. Whereas if you look at a chicken doesn't fly, or very rarely flies. It only flies if it's in danger and it needs to get out of, get away from the fox, something like that. So a chicken's breast just needs to be fast and explosive, so it will use the creatine phosphate system and it will have type 2B muscle fibres. So when it sees the fox, it needs to get out of danger, it can flap its wings, be very fast but very explosive, and that's it, and that's why chicken breast is white in colour. But then if you kind of put them together, so you're not working for 10 seconds, but you're working for less than 2 minutes, your muscle fibres are generally pink in colour. So again, if you think of a chicken's legs that it walks around on, it does walk on them, but it doesn't walk miles and miles, so they're pink in colour. And that's the middle, essentially. It's your lactic acid system, or it's your type 2A muscle fibres, which are like fast twitch. And these fibres will produce a medium amount of force in a medium amount of speed for a medium amount of time. Roughly, you're looking for like between 10 seconds and 2 minutes, so they're bang in the middle. And their blood supply will depend. If you train aerobically, then these fibres will start to look and adapt to be more aerobic. They will start to get better blood supplies. They'll start to adapt to become better at aerobic exercise. Whereas if you start to do more exercise towards your type 2B fibres, they will start to look more whiter and pinker in colour rather than red. So they're the ones in the middle that can adapt accordingly. So hopefully just a table. If you can remember the first column, you remember the last column, then the middle column's just a bit of a bridge in the middle, hopefully. Okay, so just a summary, hopefully, on the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, how we send an electrical impulse down that system to our muscles, how our muscle then contracts, the structure of that muscle, the type of muscles we have, and then finally the different types of muscle fibres and how those fibres link in with the energy systems. So that is the nervous system.